Hello everyone, and welcome to the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice webinar today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Allison Miles, and I'm one of the facilitators of the online adaptation communities of practice, which are run by us here at OKR, which is the Ontario Centre for Climate Impacts and Adaptation Resources. And I'm sitting here with my colleague Annette Morin at the OKR office, which we're located at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. So today's webinar is the second part of a two-part webinar series titled Tree Vulnerability to Climate Change and Implications for Adaptive Silviculture. The webinar series describes recent advances in the quantifications of the three components of forest vulnerability to climate change, which includes exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity in Canadian forests. Last week we heard from Isabelle Aubin, present on the integrated assessment of Canadian forest vulnerability to climate change, particularly items to go over. So first, for those who have dialed into the conference call line, your lines have been automatically muted. The reason for this is just to avoid any audio distractions or feedback during the webinar. If you prefer to ask a question over the telephone during the Q&A session, all you're going to have to do is just dial *6 and that will unmute your phone line. But please do keep your lines muted during the presentation. And although we do have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar, that doesn't mean that you have to hold your questions until the very end. So as we go through the webinar, please feel free to type out your questions in the chat box area on the left, but just note that we will address those questions at the end. Also, if you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, as a few of you have, please hover your mouse over Annette's name in the attendee list. It's just under host, and you can start a private chat with her, or you can also email her, which you'll see her email at the top of the chat box there. I also want to mention that we are recording the webinar today, and we will be sending out a copy of the recording to those who have registered for today's webinar. So finally, I know we have some people on the line today who may not be familiar with the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice, or the FACoP. So I want to take this opportunity to quickly mention that it's an interactive online community dedicated to those who are working in forestry or who are simply interested in forestry and climate change adaptation in Canada. The FACoP is made possible with support from the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers Climate Change Task Force, and it includes features such as an online resource library, news articles, discussion forums, and upcoming climate change events. And it's free to join. So if there's anyone online today who's interested in learning more, you can just scroll up the chat box there, and the link's right there for you to click on and register. So with that being said, we are very excited to have Samuel Royal Tardif on the line with us today to talk about quantifying the adaptive capacity of tree species and the implications for silviculture. So just to give you a little bit more information about our presenter today, Samuel is a forest biologist working for the Canadian Forest Service at the Great Lakes Forestry Centre in Sault Ste. Marie, and with the Laurentian Forestry Centre in Quebec City. His research interests aim at understanding the response of natural and managed forests to disturbances and stress, and the underlying importance of forest biodiversity in determining such response. Samuel holds a PhD in biology from the Université de Sherbrooke from 2011 and has completed a postdoctoral position at the Université de Québec en Haute from 2014 to 17. So on behalf of everyone joining us, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you, Samuel, for taking the time to present this webinar with us today. It is very much appreciated. So without further ado, I will now turn things over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much for this introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to present two projects that I am currently leading as part of the Canadian Forest Service in the team of Isabelle Aubin at the Great Lakes Forestry Centre. However, because I live in Quebec City, I am currently based at the Laurentian Forestry Centre in Quebec City. This work is done with many collaborators, including Laura Boisvert-Marsh at the Great Lakes Forestry Centre, Julie Godbout and Nathalie Isabelle from the Laurentian Forestry Centre, and Frédéric Doyon from the Université du Québec en Outaouais and the Institut des Sciences de la Forêt Tempérée. The work that I will present today is performed under the program Forest Change of the Canadian Forest Service, and the research program Forest Adapté, led by the Université du Québec en Outaouais. The presentation today will be in two parts. First, I will define the concept of adaptive capacity and detail how we could quantify it for tree species. Next, I will build on the knowledge gained from adaptive capacity and other aspects of forest vulnerability to present a conceptual framework for adaptation silviculture that we are currently preparing for publication. So, first, what is adaptive capacity? Adaptive capacity is one of the three components defining vulnerability to climate change. It is the capacity of a species to cope with the expected changes. It is distinct from the two other components, exposure and sensitivity to climate change, which have been discussed last week by Isabelle Aubin. Exposure is the magnitude of environmental change experienced by a species, whereas sensitivity is the degree to which a species is likely to be affected once exposed. Together, exposure and sensitivity define the potential impact expected under climate change. It is this potential impact that can be further modulated by the adaptive capacity to yield the final vulnerability to climate change. So, adaptive capacity is a broad term that can be applied to different organization levels. Apart from the tree species level, adaptive capacity can be defined at the level of forests composed of different species and different developmental stages. It can also be applied to the forest communities of people that work in and live from the forest. And we can finally consider the adaptive capacity of organizations, such as governments or private companies who take part in forest management. Before going any further, it is important to clarify that today we will be focusing on the capacity of tree species to adapt to climate change. So, tree species. Perhaps we can better understand what is adaptive capacity if we consider the change in climatic conditions that will be experienced by tree species in the next century. Aspen, for example, will see its climatic niche migrate northward. On the left, the map indicates the current climatic suitability for the growth of aspen in brown and the location corresponding to the average climatic envelope in green. On the right, the map represents where the same climatic conditions will be present at the end of the century. In response to this change, aspen will either migrate to the location of its new climatic niche, such as represented in blue, persist in place and adapt to the new climatic conditions, presented in orange, or face extension, represented by the red circle. Considering the velocity of climate change, it's not all tree species that may migrate fast enough to track the climatic niche. And even if they do succeed to migrate, they will face novel growing conditions never experienced before, such as different soils, different photoperiod, and even different biotic interactions with competitors or pathogens. Therefore, the capacity of tree species to adapt to new growing conditions will likely determine their productivity in the future and their capacity to persist in situ. Adaptive capacity can be defined as three spatial scales that describe different mechanisms occurring at different temporal scales. First, at the individual scale, tree may acclimate to the novel conditions through plasticity in important traits. Plasticity here is the capacity of an individual to present different values of the same trait. Adaptation may also occur at the population level. Since there are genetic differences between individuals, some may be already better adapted to the upcoming conditions. The level of genetic diversity in a population would thus act as a form of insurance that some individuals may be better adapted to the new conditions. And finally, adaptation may occur at the species level through evolutionary processes that will yield better adapted individuals. Evolution here corresponds to a change in the heritable characteristics of a species over generations. To quantify the adaptive capacity of a species, we have to consider each of these axes, of these scales. And we designed the following rosette to summarize all the information required to quantify a species' adaptive capacity. This work is using the same format as the previous work presented last week by Isabelle Aubin to quantify species sensitivity to drought, fire, and migration failure. In the next slide, I will explain how this figure is built. First, we have 4 different axes in dark blue that correspond to the different scales that we just mentioned, starting in the bottom right position for the smallest scale to the upper right corner for the larger scale. These axes depict the 3 scales of adaptation that I talked earlier. The individual scale for the first axis, the population scale for the second axis, and the scale of species evolution for the last 2 axes. Then, within each axis, we find different mechanisms in light blue that contribute to adaptation. And finally, we report all the metrics used to quantify each mechanism. For the rest of the presentation, I will go through each individual axis to explain our approach. First, adaptation at the individual scale. This is perhaps the most important axis of adaptation on the short term. We want to know if our mature forest will be able to sustain the stresses and disturbances that are expected with climate change. And adaptation at this scale may occur when individuals will alter their traits to be better adapted to the growing conditions. Examples of such traits are the timing of bud burst, wood properties, or leaf properties. I recognize that it might be difficult to distinguish individual adaptation through plasticity from individual tolerance of the new conditions. Tolerance indicates how much a tree may survive in adverse conditions. Eventually, tolerant individuals will need a relief in the stressful conditions if they are not adapted to them. On the contrary, adaptive plasticity allows an individual tree to keep performing in the altered conditions because it altered its traits or functioning to remain fit to the novel conditions. An example of the plasticity is the way trees can alter the shape and size of their leaves in response to light and the associated drought stress. Leaves that are more exposed to sun are also more exposed to desiccation and thus may be thicker to better retain water. This is shown here where the ratio of the leaf mass to its surface on the y-axis is represented along a gradient of increasing light availability on the x-axis. At high light, leaves are thick and thus the leaf mass per area is high. At low light, leaves are thinner and this ratio decreases. The plasticity here is represented by the slope of the blue line. We can then compare the slope, or plasticity, to that of another species. In this case, the blue species would have a greater plasticity to light than the red species, and thus a greater capacity to adapt in different light conditions. I extracted the information in the literature to compute this plasticity. The value of the slope for different species that are present in Canada. This plasticity is represented here on the x-axis. The species names on the y-axis correspond to the first letters of the genus and species names in Latin. I would like to draw your attention on 3 different species: American beech in green, red maple in red, and sugar maple in blue, that we will follow through the rest of the presentation. We can see here that there is a large variation in their plasticity, which can be attributed to different experimental conditions under which plasticity was measured. The number of different plasticity observations is presented on the right of the species name, or on the left of the figure. This graph shows that for these 3 species, the level of plasticity is similar to each other. We will now move to the second axis, which is the diversity of response in the population. This diversity is basically related to how the individual trees in a population are genetically different from each other. So here, I use a metric describing the level of genetic diversity in a population, the heterozygosity. Again, I looked in the literature for reported measures of heterozygosity for our tree species, and these values are reported here. So here the x-axis indicates the level of genetic diversity in populations of each species. For our three species, we begin to see some differences. Among these, American beech presents a low level of genetic diversity, sugar maple is intermediate, and red maple has a high level of genetic diversity. This means that within a population, beech trees are more likely to respond in a similar manner to environmental change than for red maple. Our third axis quantifies the extent to which the genetic material within populations can be recombined to yield better adapted individuals. Species that will have multiple opportunities to reproduce and mix their genetic material will have more chances to yield adapted individuals. This axis depends on three mechanisms: the extent to which different genetic materials are combined when a new individual is produced, which is the extent of genetic recombination, then the fecundity, which is the number of individuals produced, and finally the dispersal ability of the seeds produced. To better understand this axis, we will compare our three species: beech, sugar maple, and red maple. The extent of genetic recombination depends on how far the pollen can disperse and the rate of inbreeding, or how often they reproduce with the same genetic material, which does not contribute to adaptation. So here, the pollen of all our species is dispersed by wind and insects, which is good because wind is an excellent pollen disperser. Next, we can see that beech and sugar maple rarely inbreed compared to red maple that can inbreed. This is not good for red maple because evolution is slowed by inbreeding. However, red maple produces a lot of seeds and reproduces at a younger age than the other species, offering more possibilities for evolution to occur. Finally, red maple produces smaller seeds that disperse farther than the other species, what increases the level of genetic mixture within populations. So overall, even if red maple has a certain degree of inbreeding, its other traits indicate that the chances of genetic exchange within populations are large for this species. Finally, our fourth adaptation axis considers the possibilities to exchange genetic material between individuals beyond the population level. I recognize here that these exchanges may take too long to occur to contribute to adaptation within the next century, because it may require multiple generations for genes from one population to reach another population. However, the genetic diversity at this spatial scale can offer resources for assisted migration and artificial breeding that can increase tree adaptive capacity on the short term. In the first mechanism, we are considering the exchange of genetic material within the same species by considering how much different populations are genetically distinct. This is called population differentiation, and it is represented in this figure. But here we have a small problem. So we have population differentiation on the x-axis, and as the other figures, we have the species name on the y-axis. The problem that we have is that different colors represent values that were derived from different methods to measure genetic differentiation. And as we can see on the right panel, the method has a strong influence on the value of genetic differentiation. Therefore, when we compare our species, we don't know if the differences observed are related to the species or the method used. This is particularly true here for red maple, where the only value provided is for chloroplastic DNA, the cpDNA on the x-axis on the right. And this method, cpDNA, is also a method yielding, on average, higher values. So for now, we cannot compare these values. However, we can also consider exchanges beyond the species level through hybridization between different species. In fact, it is expected that such mixing between species may offer unique possibilities for adaptation. Here, I present an overview of the species that may form viable hybrids. We can see that the two maple species may hybridize with other maple species, contrary to the beech, who does not form hybrids. Acer rubrum, which is the red maple, hybridizes with silver maple, Acer saccharinum. And sugar maple hybridizes with black maple, Acer nigrum. Our final goal is to combine all the information along each axis of adaptation into a summary like this one. As we can see from our data, among our three modeled species, red maple would be the species with the highest adaptive capacity, whereas beech would have the lowest. I am currently gathering the information for other tree species in Canada. Up to now, we have 25 species almost completed, and we seek to add more in the following year. Eventually, the goal of this approach will be to translate this type of information into adaptation practices that will help low adaptive species, promote natural adaptive capacity, or take advantage of some genetic particularity. Such practices may be based on the scale of adaptation. First, we have to consider if this capacity increases the persistence of mature trees, the persistence of forest cover, or the persistence of whole tree species. Information at the smallest scale will guide the choice of species to use for reforestation or to favor in mature forests. At the next scale, measures of population genetic diversity will inform and encourage practices that will preserve genetic diversity. At the species level, adaptive capacity will inform practices aiming at preserving habitat connectivity and evolutionary potential, or identify genetic resources for assisted migration and breeding programs. Finally, all this process can also help identify the species with low adaptive capacity that would require more attention in the future. This scenario of practices would be very interesting if we had all the information required to quantify adaptive capacity along each axis. However, as we have seen in this presentation, for many mechanisms and axes, we currently don't have sufficient data of quality and quantity to quantify the adaptive capacity. This is especially true for species with low economic value. Axes and mechanisms for which we don't have sufficient data are presented in gray. In addition, even if we have all the information required, this evaluation is not a prediction of adaptive response. Our approach only quantifies the indicators that evolution and adaptation may occur. As a result, there is still a large uncertainty remaining in the quantification of tree species adaptive capacity and future persistence in situ. Moreover, this uncertainty adds up to that surrounding climate forecasting, to that concerning the frequency and localization of extreme events, and finally, to the uncertainty in the needs and the health of future markets for forest products. We realize that uncertainty is a characteristic that needs to be acknowledged and dealt with in silviculture and forest management. We now enter the second part of this presentation, where I will present a conceptual framework that addresses and integrates these uncertainties. And here, this framework suggests to distribute the risk associated with forest productivity losses across landscapes by trying different approaches. These approaches are based on the concept of functional zoning in order to design diversified and robust landscapes. Functional zoning is an approach developed a few decades ago that apportions different silviculture intensities to different portions of a landscape in order to fulfill all management objectives from biodiversity conservation to timber production. Applied in a context of adaptation to climate change, functional zoning would represent three different adaptation approaches. First, oops, I forgot this one. Okay. First, we let nature a chance to adapt to climate change by establishing an adequate network of natural reserves. Second, we manage forests based on our best knowledge to build resilient forests. That is to say, forests that have more chance to persist under climate change and adapt to the novel growing conditions. Third, we can produce wood as fast as we can in intensive plantations to minimize the time that productive forests are exposed to climate change. The novelty of our approach is to recognize that functional zoning is an interesting solution for adaptation to climate change if we consider that forests might be vulnerable to different levels. Basically, three levels of vulnerability can be defined based on the fate of the future forest. At low vulnerability, forests may retain a similar structure and composition. At an intermediate level, they may undergo profound changes in structure and composition. And at the highest level, forests may transition to other ecosystems such as shrublands or grasslands. We propose a portfolio approach where each level of vulnerability can be managed under different silviculture intensities. Recognizing the full scope of these possibilities may offer unique opportunities to adapt to climate change. In low vulnerability sites, it may offer the best opportunities to preserve sensitive species threatened by climate change or act as a genetic reserves for the restoration of disturbed areas. These forests may also help in the migration of climate-sensitive species. In sites at intermediate vulnerability, conservation areas will let nature expose the current species compositions to climate change in order to favor and promote novel adaptations or novel resilient species assemblages. At the highest level of vulnerability, conservation areas will let nature design the novel ecosystems adapted to climate change. In such locations, we would have to allow the loss of forest habitats to see the new species assemblages and novel adaptations that nature can develop. Monitoring the response of natural assemblages at each of these vulnerability levels will be crucial to inform and adapt active management approaches, which are the next two levels of silviculture intensity. At the second level of silviculture intensity, low vulnerability forests could be managed under ecosystem-based management, but including notions of adaptation silviculture. This is what is currently mostly done in forest management. It aims at preserving sensitive forest features in a human-managed world. At intermediate vulnerability, we use our best knowledge to predict the future threats and forest conditions under climate change and prescribe the best adapted or most robust scenarios. This is what is currently considered as adaptation silviculture. It allows species adaptation in a human-managed world. It might also favor the more resistant and resilient species mixtures, and to reach this goal, it can consider the assisted migration of tree populations to ensure forest productivity. And at the highest level of vulnerability, we might want to design ourselves the novel ecosystems if nature may be too slow to respond, or if there is a particular risk associated with natural conversion, such as fueling wildfire. Here, we must accept that some species and functions will be lost, but we might select new species to sustain ecosystem functions or the production of goods that we judge important. This knowledge approaches assumes that we can predict the future and we adequately understand ecosystem functioning. However, this knowledge needs to be constantly updated from the information gained from monitoring the response of natural systems and ameliorations in climatic models and vulnerability assessment. The previous options may be less efficient to ensure a sustainable and sufficient wood provisioning for the forest industry. Therefore, a last important option is to intensively produce timber in forest plantations where productivity is maximized. This option offers the possibility to still use sensitive species, but under really short rotations to reduce the time exposed to climate change. At intermediate vulnerability level, novel forest plantations may be designed by increasing the diversity of plantations, trying new species mixtures, or relying on genetic advances to improve planted species. This option can also reduce exposure and potential forest vulnerability through protection against fire and pests, soil fertilization, or managing the competing vegetation. Finally, at the highest level of vulnerability, productivity may still be envisioned in novel ecosystems as new products may be developed. Copies or biomass fields may represent new possibilities. All these options are devoted to preserve the stability of wood supply in a changing world by encouraging innovation and productivity in the forest sector. Finally, we believe that this framework is important to promote diverse and resilient landscapes while preserving ecosystem functions, services, and products. However, it has two important conditions. First, interventions in one option must not threaten the goals of another. This means that we need sufficient information about the new species introduced to limit the risk of invasion or genetic pollution. Second, it also requires that we can adequately quantify forest vulnerability to climate to avoid converting forests that could otherwise persist. And the laboratory of Isabelle Aubin is currently working on this last condition to provide tools to quantify and map forest vulnerability. So, this ends my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will now answer your questions.
Excellent. That was great. Thank you, Samuel. So we now have about 25 minutes left for questions. Again, if you'd like to use the chat box, please feel free to go ahead and type out your questions there. We have a few already to go over. And if you're on the conference line with us and would prefer to ask a question over the telephone, you just need to hit *6 to unmute your lines. So we will start with the questions in the chat box we have so far. So the first question is from Ajay Prado. Other than the leaf mass / light ratio, what other indications of plasticity were considered?
For now, I only had the time and the energy, I would say, to look at the leaf mass ratio, but it would be very important to look at phenology. Plasticity and bud burst is very, very important. And I would like also to look at the wood properties that as I mentioned, because the capacity of the trees to modulate the thickness of their conduits may help in resisting drought. So this is a very important feature that we could look in the future.
Excellent. So our second question is from Betty. Did you consider reproductive capacity in your traits? Can the species reproduce in novel climates or beyond its current range?
Yeah, this is really interesting. The thing is that indeed all the traits we considered for the genetic recombination within populations can be altered by the climatic conditions. And yes, there can be an interaction in between fecundity and the future climate. But for now, I did not consider these possibilities. But yeah, it could be something very interesting to look at in the future.
Excellent. So we have another question here from Andrew Park. Have you considered the concept of cryptic maladaptation, in which a genotype may be planted or subject to assisted migration, so do okay for years, but then succumb to an extreme weather event outside of its tolerance limits?
Yeah, this is something very, very interesting, very important also, and it kind of it's the kind of information and of mechanism that brought me to consider and to put importance on the uncertainties, because there are so multiple cryptic mechanisms that can occur in novel conditions that we don't know of, and so we must acknowledge that we don't know sometimes, and maybe it's something that that can be accounted with the framework that I presented at the end of the presentation. But also, I'm not very familiar with the concept of cryptic maladaptation, but this is definitely something that I want to look more at in the future, and also all the limitations that we have with assisted migration, and the need to get more information to go ahead with this adaptation practice.
Excellent. So we have another question here from Francois. What about the soils in your analyses? You can have a species with a high adaptive capacity regarding its traits, but migrate where soil conditions are not suitable for the species.
Excuse me, I missed the part. Could you repeat the question?
I can. So the question is, what about the soils in your analyses? You can have a species with a high adaptive capacity regarding its traits, but then migrate where soil conditions are not suitable for the species.
Yeah, this is kind of, it's really interesting, and it's really a possible problem. It's considering the interaction between migration and adaptive capacity. For now, we consider the adaptive capacity in terms of by excluding the concept of migration. So adaptive capacity would be the capacity of a species to persist in situ. So, but I recognize that there could be some problems concerning the novel soil conditions.
Perfect. So another question came in from David. He says, excellent presentation, merci. Have you found that forest managers are receptive to managing in a more diverse manner, as you suggest?
Yeah, it might be this is the reason why I wanted to present at the FACoP. Because for now, these are really new thoughts that I had concerning forest management, and I haven't presented this framework to practitioners. So I'm not aware of what can be the possible limitations or barriers to the implementation of this framework. But also, for now, the concept of functional zoning has been running for like 2 or 3, almost 3 decades, and it's beginning to be ideas that people are aware of. So I would really appreciate getting some feedback on the perception and the vision that the practitioners would have about this framework.
Excellent. I will go to the phone lines now because that's all we have in our chat box for questions. Is there anyone on the phone lines with questions or comments? And if so, just a reminder, press *6 to unmute your phone line first.
Hello, Samuel. This is Greg O'Neill calling from British Columbia.
Hello.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I'm interested in this concept of functional zonation as it applies to assisted migration. Here in BC, we implemented a system of assisted migration for all species in April. And I guess my question to you is, how would a system of functional zonation apply to assisted migration?
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest difficulty with my framework, is how we reconcile assisted migration in this context. Also, assisted migration at large scale. So, for now, I consider most assisted migration to occur in a context of wood production. So, it would be a small-scale assisted migration in the context that I developed the framework. However, I will have to read more about assisted migration, and especially, as you mentioned, the context of British Columbia, to see how it could fit in this framework.
Thank you.
So just quickly to answer Kathy's question, we do have a slide deck available. If you go to the pot at the top left there is a PDF available for downloads. So that should be available for all participants on the webinar today. I will just take one more second to ask if there's any more questions on the phone lines. So Kathy, we can send the link out again, or not the link, but the PDF for participants in the follow-up email as well if you're having trouble at all downloading that. In the meantime, we have another question from Amanda here. Have you done any research into which adaptive silviculture techniques would be helpful for adaptive capacity, or is that outside of the scope of your research?
Yeah, we're not at the level of studying practices and the influence on adaptive capacity. We are just trying to quantifying a concept that is very common in the literature, but has seldom been quantified. So it's like a first step of a big research agenda, that we could say. Yeah, and yes, we would like to look at such questions, how we can manage for adaptive capacity in the future.
Perfect. So I see we have a few more people typing right now. So we'll give them a few minutes just to see if there's any more questions. Kind of last call for questions on the phone line as well. We have one more. So from Michael, with respect to adaptive capacity, how do you weigh all of the variables?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there is no answer for now. We can try a weighing system to yield some indices. But for now, I'm just at the part that I want to collect the information along each axis and each mechanism. And eventually, we have to consider all this information at once. We can't, let's say, develop an indices like between 1 and 5 and say that 5 will persist and 1 won't. We cannot do that yet, and I don't think it would be useful. But for now, we're gathering the information to when we have a question, okay, how this species perform in terms of plasticity, what is its level of genetic diversity? When we have the question, we can access the information quickly.
Perfect. So, are there any final questions or comments before we wrap things up? I don't think I see anyone typing right now, but please.
Okay, so this is me, the graduate in Edmonton with Alberta Agriculture and Forestry. So thank you for your nice presentation. So I just want to make a kind of a general comment. If you, I think before we see the value of climate change adaptation in forestry, we have, I think, to somehow consider it into different contexts. One can be climate change adaptation in the context of managing the natural forest, and the other one in managing a plantation where we just clear cut the stand and then plant trees, which is a way of creating and managing a plantation. So the climate change adaptation there are different. And if you ask a forester, probably is interested in the plantation part of it, where you just cut and plant a stand, 50 years, you harvest it or whatever, and then you plant it again. So the climate change adaptation then is different. For us in forestry, the important thing in there is essentially to choose the seed source. And then choice of the seed source means you are just basically choosing the genetics of the material that will be planted on the site. And then how genetically diverse it is, that become also a question which you have also touched in there, because we are managing something that has to be there for a very long time. And once we have done that, really what it takes for us to maintain wood fiber production in that area is then to manage the stand. So in Canada here, we are still operating largely on public land where we combine multiple objectives in there. So climate change adaptation then it would be a little bit different if we want to combine maintenance of these other values like genetic diversity, mixture of the species, whatever. But in terms of, if I was looking at wood production, really what matters is one species, pure stand, intensively managed, and then you have got your product. So I think before we can see the species to have different level of vulnerability, we have to think in terms of changing the paradigm of what we think forest management should be all about. Okay, so currently we are just managing as a way of restoring the original ecosystem that was there. If it's a mixture of 4 or 5 species, we want to maintain that. But in actual sense, that shouldn't be a constraint. If we want a spruce stand to produce spruce fiber, then we plant a spruce stand, manage it intensively with the proper seed source, with the proper level of genetic diversity to sustain it for, say, 80 years or 100 years. So I think part of our climate change adaptation should first start by that changing the paradigm of how we see the forest. We shouldn't see the forest necessarily as a mixture of species, because that is a transitory vegetation which would have changed itself in the future as the species succession proceeds.
I'm not sure to understand the question, but I would say with the points that you brought, that we often distinguish two types of forests. On one hand, we have the monoculture, intensive plantations, and reduced biodiversity. And on the other hand, we have like the nature, try to preserve the attribute of the old forest or the natural forest and species mixtures. But I think that we can have all the forests that are in between these two extremes, and we can manage this gradient. And it would be interesting because if, in the final, if we say that diversity is important in our stance, and we end up doing the biggest species mixture, we're going to mix all three species together and plant only this, and it ends up with a landscape with the same stand structure everywhere. So I think it is important to have some monocultures, some species mixtures, and some natural stands. It's important to have a gradient of species mixture, and also diversity is not only the species, it's also the genetic diversity that you will have in your stand. So if you want to have some stability or some insurance that some tree may persist or may still produce in the future, increasing the genetic diversity of the populations is very important.
Excellent. So we just have a few minutes left. So we'll just give a few seconds for, again, one last call on the phone lines and in the chat box here. We have Andrew Park typing. Perfect. So Andrew says that he disagrees categorically with the caller on the line. The caller would select one species, one genotype, and rely on that growing into the future, presumably to optimize fiber supply, but we do not know what future climate we are aiming for. For that reason, many monoculture plantations planted today are likely to fail in the future because they will become maladapted. So that was more of a comment, but nonetheless important. Are there any more questions? If not,
just to say,
go ahead, Samuel.
Just to say, I really like Andrew's comment because it depends on the perspective. So it could be something interesting to discuss in the future.
Definitely, definitely. So if there is any more questions, Samuel kindly did provide his email on the slide that's up right now. And again, we will make sure that participants have a copy of this PDF for future. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us today for this FACoP webinar. We hope that you enjoyed it. I'd like to send a very big thank you to you, Samuel, for your time and effort and for a great informative presentation. Are there any comments from you before we sign off? No? Okay, great. Well, thanks again, everyone. That's it for today. So have a great week, and we will be sending in an email with the recording and a short survey later today or tomorrow. Bye for now.